we'll start in a few minutes. It seems that some people are still dribbling in. So I'm extremely happy to have Nancy here. She's been a great friend since she first came to Japan. And she has an enormous fan club, and so we decided to invite her for our season's finale. And
this is the real world.
This is, yes, you know, we resurface sometime in September. So she was, as you know, a Fulbright recipient twice in Japan, Germany. She was an Abe Fellow. She's taught at Keio. She's published and edited 11 books, but she's very modest, so she only took one here, I think, to show, not the 11. And among other things is a handbook of propaganda studies, which I recommend to you. She was a professor emeritus at Cal State Fullerton, and she now has a Pax Mundi, as in world peace, professor of public diplomacy at Kyoto University of Foreign Studies. And she's now finished a book on Japan's information warfare, which is being translated in Japanese. Japan's information warfare, information war. Okay, so everybody is advised. Everybody is advised to order it. Who published it?
It was published at Amazon, but it's now being translated into Japanese.
Okay.
Well, I have a translator, and it will be published by Shindo.
Okay, well, thanks very much. So again, thanks, Nancy, for being here. We'll let you start. I think you have an amazing 4 or 5D presentation. And then we'll have our usual Q&A session. But as I said, you need no guidance on how to do a presentation. So the floor is yours for either 3 minutes or 3 hours.
Thank you very much. First of all, I want to thank everybody who's here after happy hour on a Friday night. So you really honor me with your presence. When Robert got in touch with me, we were talking about what day I would do this presentation, and originally we were thinking Monday, July 23rd, which in fact is the 2-year, exactly to the day, from the opening ceremony of the Summer Olympics. So the reason why I called this Super Nation Brand Japan, in part, is because this is a bit of an anniversary for me. I first gave this talk after I met Robert in 2013 when I was an Abe Fellow. I've learned a lot more about Japan since then. But of course, at that time in 2013, so much of the narrative had to do with the post-3/11. Recovery, redemption, resilience values of Japan. It's changed so much, it's shifted a lot, and now we're anticipating 2020, and there are so many markers that we expect with 2020 in terms of women in the C-suites, right? We're going to have all these women show up in politics, in the corporation, moving up the ladder. We're expecting 40 million foreign visitors. I say we, those of us in Japan, but the government is really promoting globalization. And in these slides tonight, I tried to focus on 3 areas. I call them the 3 Gs. I haven't gotten away from this. Globalization, gender, and generation. And I did a rehearsal of this talk yesterday at Kyoto Gaidai, and my students, I have about half Japanese and half foreign students in public diplomacy, and international relations is mostly Japanese students. But I put up this first slide and I said, so who's that on the left and who's that on the right? It's maybe, I love Cyndi Lauper, you probably recognize her, and she's been in the business 40+ years. Girls just want to have fun, they still do. But on the left, they drew a blank. I was a bit shocked, and I immediately held up my show and tell, and I said, have you seen this book, Made in Japan? Many of you who are really, truly Japan experts remember this. This was first published in 1987, and you see this wonderful, charismatic face of Morita, naturally the co-founder of Sony. So I wanted us to begin tonight with a little bit of a walk down memory lane and really to see where Japan was 30, 40 years ago, and then I'll move very quickly to talking about 2020 and beyond. But I was struck by this image because, of course, when Sony bought out CBS Records, that was a $2 billion buyout. 1988, for me, Japan meant I was able to buy a Sony Walkman. I mean, that was incredible to have portable music. And I thought of Japan in terms of electronics and then really good cars. But as you remember, though, Sony, with this buyout, this was a bit of a threat. There were many in the United States who worried that the American culture would be kind of changed by this influx of Japanese buying these icons of the American culture. And so I think to have this image on the New York Times Magazine to show this is a very happy union was really important to the image of Japan in the world. This, again, was about 4 or 5 years before the downturn and what we began to call the lost decade, which then became the lost decades. So just, you know, remember this image as we go forward. I don't know who's advancing the slides. They're way, the laptop. Can somebody help me out with the advance? Because oh, do I have this? So this is going to work? What do I do here? Okay. Yeah. All right. Before I talk about this wonderful person, let me add with Morita, just to remind you that Sony was established in 1946, April, 9 months after, roughly, the end of World War II. Japan was, of course, in many parts of Japan in rubble. And the Japanese had surrendered on the USS Missouri in 1945. So here comes along this upstart company in 1946. And the more I read about Morita, he's really a hero to me, whether he's Japanese or not. There are so many who inspire me because he was a lieutenant in the Imperial Navy. He received his degree in physics from Osaka Imperial University. And he was expected as the firstborn son to take over the family business, sake, and I think they also were miso makers. But he had no passion for it. And so he set out with his partner, Masaru Ibuka, to found Sony. And they started out in 1946 in a burned out third floor of a former department store in downtown Tokyo. And within about, I guess, 7 years or so, Morita, he started going overseas to see about other products and to compare what Japan was doing. And he came across the Netherlands, and he later said that it was, in many respects, the first taste of a nation branding prowess of another country. He said, quote, "I saw an agricultural country in the Netherlands with many windmills and many bicycles, and yet it was producing goods of excellent quality and had worldwide sales power. I thought that maybe Japanese could do it too." And he was really troubled to his dismay that made in Japan in the early 50s did not have a good reputation. It was not known for high quality. There were a lot of products, he said, Morita said, that he discovered that meant there was a shoddiness or a kitsch kind of to the products. So he said, I'm going to make products that really are high quality and that the world will come to embrace. By 1990, he did a really important interview, a sit-down interview, because of course he spoke quite good English, and he sat down with Ted Koppel. And for any Americans here, you know Ted Koppel for many, many years. He was the journalist, the host of ABC News Nightline. So the entire Nightline was devoted to Sony. And there's a quote in the program where they say, the genius with Sony was creating products we don't even know we want, but once on the shelves, we can't get enough of them. And I think in a way that was sort of the birth of this nation brand Japan that we're seeing even to this day. And his partner Ibuka said that at the core, Sony was about making things, and they thought in broad terms of how these products could enhance people's lives and cultures. There's a part of the interview, you can look it up on YouTube, just look up Marita Nightline, and Ted Koppel says, well, what is it that the Japanese can teach America? And it's quite poignant, and he said, well, for a Japanese company, it's not just about profit. It is about loyalty to the employees, that you want to be good to them, they want to be good to you in return. It was a social contract, and it was devoted not to just this kind of profit we see so often in capitalism, Western capitalism, but rather this sort of taking care of the employee, that you're part of maybe a larger extended family. As a result, there were many in the United States who began to study Japanese style of management. So that became very popular at Harvard, MBA programs, and many other places. And I can remember this well because I was in graduate school during these years. So we just figured Japan would overtake the United States economy by about 2000. And so the bottom line really with that, with Marita, is that the spirit of personal enhancement, making people's lives better through making stuff that people like, is perhaps at the heart of today's super nation brand Japan. Now here, this slide, I don't know if anybody recognizes the Grand Chef Imahira. He's in Yokohama, and he works, he is the Grand Chef of Mute Kiro. Excuse my Japanese, but I'll do my best. It's a restaurant in the Motomachi district of Yokohama. They use fresh vegetables in season from local farms. And they say that they put a Yokohama spin on traditional French fare. I have had one of their really incredible meals, set meals with many courses, and it was one of the best experiences of my life. And when I went to interview him, he was so passionate about his life's work. I sort of on the spot concluded that he was the Morita of food, at least to me. And what he does on the side, besides teaching all of the young chefs coming up, he's very devoted to them, he goes into the schools. But there's even a better story here. The story is that his wife, she's fine now, but she had to go into the hospital. And we all know universally hospital food is so recognized for high quality, right? We can't wait. Some of us even go to the hospital just to try that food. Naturally, we don't do that. But he could see that his wife probably was missing some of his best dishes. And so he worked with the staff at Yokohama Municipal Citizens Hospital to provide patients with really delicious and nutritious cuisine instead of hospital food. And she was later released, and as a result now, this story spread around the community, and he's bringing out a cookbook in the fall that is designed to help hospitals in the area. Maybe it'll even go global, who knows. But when you think of how we treat patients, treating them holistically really requires nutritious meals, but also tasty meals. Why should people have to miss out on that just because they're convalescing? So I think with this story about him, it is another sort of an example of all these stories connected to nation brand Japan that we don't know about unless we go out and start talking to people. And I look forward to going out with him in the fall, actually, to some of these local farms to see how he approaches the food. Now let me see if I can advance. I'm going to give you an entirely different slide here. Japan, to anyone who comes, especially a first-time visitor, and many foreign visitors are not necessarily repeat customers, but Japan is on their bucket list. And what they often say, though, they're so amazed at the convenience and naturally the convenience stores. So Nippon.com, which does a lot of great research, they created this slide based on religious statistics of the Agency for Cultural Affairs, and then they compared it to the number of konbini. I thought I got a kick out of that. So there are over 50,000 of these konbini, and the big three, of course, are Lawson's, Family Mart, and 7-Eleven. 7-Eleven is ranked #1 Japanese company on Entrepreneur Magazine's top 500 franchise list. And of the 64,000 7-Eleven stores around the globe, 20,000 are located in Japan, with about 2,600 in Tokyo alone. I don't know how many of you all knew this. Recently, there was some fanfare about a book called Konbini Ninjin. Did anybody read that? Convenience Store Woman, which depicts the reality of life for many women who work part-time with no benefits. Even though it's based loosely on the author's life, Sayaka Murata, who has worked at a konbini, I think it's a good account of what is happening to many women, especially who are getting part-time jobs with no benefits, women and increasingly foreigners who are taking these jobs. So in terms of globalization, the konbini is playing a role. And when you think about how often you might dip in, especially with this heat, and grab a water, or, we're using it readily. And there's something about the konbini that really excites a lot of visitors. I have to pay tribute to Anthony Bourdain. I paid tribute to him recently in a talk. And he said in Parts Unknown, the program about Tokyo, Tokyo, quote, he said, may well be the most amazing food city in the world, with a nearly unimaginable variety of places staked one on top of the other, tucked away on every level of densely packed city streets. At Lawson's, you can dig into their unnaturally fluffy, insanely delicious, incongruously addictive egg salad sandwiches. He said, I love them, layer after layer after layer of awesome. Proud eateries, sounds very much like Anthony Bourdain, proud eateries serving who knows what, but it all smells delicious and looks enticing. And after I read that, I got inspired to write a piece for Huffington Post called Lawson's Geek, my love affair with Japan's convenience stores. And I wrote about all of the products that you can get there. I mean, it's just one-stop shopping. So what does this slide mean, really, though, in terms of comparing shrines and temples to convenience stores? What does it say about Japan? I'm not sure, but perhaps it's reminding us of Japan's legacy priorities: spirituality, redemption, reflection, before an iced matcha. I'm not sure. But so this, we continue on our journey, and I just kind of pulled slides that have affected me, impacted me over the last 5 years. And what is this slide? Does anybody recognize it? It's a schematic. This building is not yet open. The Okara. And you see, of course, that there's going to be this gigantic glass tower, which is so rare in Tokyo, right? And then if you use a magnifying glass, you can see traditional Japan right down here. There were those of us who went to the old Okara, and I think it was back in 2015. Many of us were protesting the demolition of the classic timepiece that was Hotel Okara's main building, with that lobby that was like the Rat Pack. And it had the Orchard Bar, if anybody remembers that. This will now be named the Okara Tokyo, and it will include a 17-story monstrosity, a glass tower, overhead to dwarf its distinct heritage. What this slide suggested to me about nation brand Japan is that we really have to continue to seek a balance between tradition and innovation. This is going to be an ongoing struggle for Japan going forward. There were several sort of Twitter online movements related to Save the Okara or My Moment at Okara. Didn't make any difference. I think they had already made up their minds about this. But many of us who were protesting and didn't want them to get rid of the old style, we were foreigners. We were not Japanese. So we felt so strongly about this Japanese aesthetic, but to, no effect. So I think this will be something that may be very well received, and I know they've tried hard to preserve some of the artifacts from the old hotel. So I just worry, though, if you kind of lose the soul of an old place. So we'll see. So on the next slide, this may be somewhat interesting because on Monday, Koike, if you remember, she's made quite a splash over the last couple of years. She will be speaking at the Foreign Press Center of Japan. And again, this will be on the 2-year kind of, getting ready for Tokyo 2020. Last year, some of us here were at a dinner, several of us here were at a dinner celebrating marriage equality. And it turns out that the G7 countries, Japan is an outlier. Japan is the only one that has not really had a national discussion on this issue, much less any sort of vote. And so the organizers from land were able to get this statement from Koike, and I thought it was at the time rather jaw-dropping because she says here, while a national discussion is required with respect to same-sex marriage, prejudice and discrimination against LGBT people must be eliminated. So there's something really happening here in Japan. I didn't mention that 25 years ago was my first trip to Japan for an international exchange program called International Youth Village, being run by the Prime Minister's office. At that time, Japan seemed much more closed, insulated, very conservative, not terribly interested, even in the summer of 1993, with keeping up with the world or sort of globalizing. That was not the dialogue then. But to fast track to this, she is somewhat of a symbol of the new Japan in terms of diversity and inclusion. I don't know what her career, how it'll play out. I don't have any real sort of direct line to her, but the fact that she put that on record, that a national discussion is required, well, that would tell me we need to ask her to have that national discussion. And not only on LGBT and same-sex marriage or marriage equality, but on a whole lot of other issues. One of my bugaboos, as much as I love Japan, and I want to be clear that I'm here as a real Japanophile, but it wouldn't be really worth your time if all I did was serve as a cheerleader. One of my bugaboos is that we don't have enough dialogue, enough national discussion on issues. And if you're going to bring a population along, a population that is in decline, that is aging, you have to give them a set of values related to a shared experience, that we're all in this together. And maybe LGBT and same-sex marriage isn't your thing, but perhaps immigration is, perhaps local revitalization. We all have our passions. Everybody in this room undoubtedly has a passion. So why aren't we having even citizen councils or national dialogue on these issues, including one that we know is very important. Now, where is Chris? This is for you. I found this image, and my students were sort of a little perplexed. Is this really necessary that you do a slide? Well, yes, it is. Because when you think about Tokyo 2020 and the world's best athletes, naturally we associate them with smoking, right? Before you do the 100-meter dash, you take a drag or two, and then you go up to the line and you go off. I lived in Southern California for 14 years, and I got so used to no smoking in restaurants. And even Cal State Fullerton, there are 23 campuses of California State University, but our university in Fullerton, right near Disneyland, was the first to ban smoking literally on the campus, where you couldn't even smoke walking across campus, and this was years ago. So I got really conditioned to this. What happens for me is that I have to check to make sure there's no smoking often in a place, at a party or a bar, because of course we go to socialize at a lot of places. I'm not trying to demonize any smokers, but in terms of the world's media focusing in on Japan, I think this actually might become a bigger issue than we anticipate, because it's part of globalization. The UN, the World Health Organization, has been pretty hard on Japan with, not so much with the percentage of smokers, but rather with making secondhand smoke eliminated. So for those who want to smoke, it's not really sort of cordoning them off, but rather allowing healthy air for the vast majority of people. So I just thought this image was quite interesting, of this obviously very attractive woman taking a drag on a cigarette. If you know the history of sort of persuasion and propaganda, for the longest time, women were not associated with smoking. Edward Bernays changed that. It's a very famous case where he had models dressed up as suffragette women walking down Fifth Avenue. Because he was hired by a tobacco company in the US to get more women to smoke. And they were smoking what were called torches of liberty. It's very clever. I think Bernays lived to be over 100, and toward the end of his life, he said that was the biggest regret he had with working with a tobacco company and manipulating public opinion that way. So I'm just trying to give you all a lot of sort of issues, put a lot out here. And what makes Japan a supernation brand? I think we have to be frank that a big part of the brand is aging, is death even. And these are the fallen petals, right, from sakura. This is right near Kita no Maru. I thought this was such a beautiful picture. We all go enjoy that time of year and that season. Isabel Reynolds for Bloomberg wrote earlier this year, she said, Japan is the world's senior citizen. Now, you wouldn't know that if you look at advertising. You wouldn't really think about that. So much advertising is about focusing on the youth. And, but it's really fitting that the sakura, Japan's cherry blossom trees, are the iconic symbol of Japan. Naturally, they stand for the fleeting nature of life and its impermanence, and that death is always around the corner. I read an article recently that by the opening ceremony, again, 2 years out, there will be 842,000 fewer Japanese citizens who will be missing out on the opening ceremony. That's a lot of falling petals, right? Isn't it? So if I were in charge of Japan's nation brand promotion, I would focus and let the world know that there is dignity in growing old, and that Japanese products will focus on providing comfort, convenience, and even companionship to those on their final journey. In fact, with either the opening ceremony or the closing ceremony, I don't see why they can't focus on across generations and include, along with the youth and women, include Japan's senior population. Maybe I'm thinking too far outside the box. But Japan is often seen, if it is indeed the world's senior citizen, then that's a call to action. What can you give the world in terms of products? What can you offer the world? And you could do a lot that would really help us to cope with that process of aging. Plenty of countries are aging, but as you'll see from my remarks, it's often the case that Japan is plucked as the example of what's around the corner. So in a way, Japan is the kind of the canary in the coal mine, you know, giving us warning. So with this decline in population, with this super aging society, what can Japan offer the world? And the world will buy those products. This is just an excerpt from what is considered one of the most memorable films in film history, and it's called Tokyo Story. And I have to tell you my own story about that. When I first came back to Japan 6 years ago to do a Fulbright at Sophia, I came across this film. I didn't know about Ozu. I didn't know about the film, 1953. And I watched it, and it so moved me. It has themes that we're still dealing with today. If you all know about the film, it's the old people going to Tokyo, and the grown-up children just don't have any time for them. They're sort of bothered by them. They get in the way, except for this wonderful daughter-in-law who lost her husband in the war, and she's very, very dear to this older couple. But in terms of storytelling, it's very impactful because it gets at what is often the sort of contemplative nature that we see in a lot of Japanese film. I mean, you could see how slow that scene played out. But when I went to share it with my students at Sophia, they didn't know it. I mean, maybe one or two knew it. And what I realized is that we're talking about the immediate post-World War II era of Japan, and there is this blank space related to that. And if you're going to try to tell your story to the world, you have to be at least up on some of these markers of storytelling that have shaped Japan's narrative over the decades. And Ozu was one who attracted the best directors in the world to come and pay homage to him. And so I realized that maybe some of these Japanese young people, they're not getting the education in what truly matters to the Japanese in that period, to Merida. I keep, again, finding out that they don't know these icons, and they really need to know them. Now, to get kind of fast forward here, this image is a image, of course, you see, yes, Shinzo Abe. You might recognize Kaori Sasaki, who's had the longest running Women in International Business Conference. I think it takes place later this month, or Sputniko on the right. But we cannot ignore, I mentioned globalization, gender, and generation. We cannot ignore the most underutilized resource in Japan. And I don't mean wind or solar. I mean, maybe that matters too, but women, of course. So we've had Abenomics, making women shine, or shine, right? I mean, depending, that sort of got a chuckle in the press. To how do you encourage more women to date and marry and procreate? And if you're going to have more women who want to both work and date, this is also an image I took of when I went to a hanami, and this is a couple. I think this is the image that the Japanese government would like to see more of, because we know what comes after marriage is often more children. But the image that keeps getting touted of Japan globally is this sexless in the city, nation state, And it is, I even got caught up in it. This was 2 years ago. If you all recall the CNN story about so-called virgins in Japan, based on a government survey, was quite misleading. I mean, I'm not sure how accurate that was, but once they had statistics suggesting that in the millennial generation, maybe 40% or more are not engaged in any dating or intimate activity, that was the story that went around the world. And it became this tag to kind of weird international news. What's going on in Japan? Even Dr. Ruth, who I think is still alive, she commented, she tweeted about this. She said, oh, the Japanese are not having sex, I need to go over there. She was a very famous sex expert in the United States. So when it comes to Japan's nation brand, I've seen this now over the years, that there is often this vacuum that is filled by the global press. And the global press will often hang their hats on the weird and wacky, on the extreme. And naturally they do that because we all, really, according to science, we all have a desire to find out about things that are curious. We like to talk about things and gossip about things. Human beings in general do. And so Japan becomes the fodder of gossip related to activities like this. So before I get to this slide, I have to say that related to this story, I heard from a CNN reporter, and I was asked to comment on this. So I'm always like, put me in, coach. I'll give it my best, right? I'm international relations. This is part of the international relations curriculum, I think. So I just gave a few thoughts about what I thought was going on. And it's probably the most traveled couple of quotes I've ever had in my career. So now I'm often called related to this little bit of an awkward situation going on in Japan, and I'm really not quite the expert in it. But what I try to do when they do call, they don't usually quote this part, but I remind them, though, that there's a certain responsibility to get deeper into the story and to not just play to these cultural stereotypes that are very entertaining, and we all kind of giggle, and I do too. But we really, at the heart of this, is to have a communication about what's really happening. If you think about the hashtag #MeToo movement and how that has at least opened up dialogue, many women stepping forward and some men, we're kind of moving into a different phase where we're asking men to be more involved in talking about Me Too. Well, why aren't we having more national conversation about what's happening with dating? Why is it that people are kind of tuning it out and turning off? This week, I came across this story, and does anybody know what this image is? It's an advertisement for a new service. Has to do with ringing up a J-pop idol. You can now call an idol in 30-second intervals. So I played it out. I had on my watch yesterday with my students, and I sort of played it out for them that, this fan, which is probably not what looks like a 12-year-old boy, but maybe a 45-year-old man, would be calling the idol, and she does answer. It's a real live idol. But just how much ground are you gonna cover in 30 seconds? And what does that really say about what's happening in a society? It's not just in Japan. There's this universal path and pattern now of kind of isolation. We're seeing that in a lot of people who do research on social media, that people are beginning to feel more comfortable with distanced communication, where they don't really have to experience true intimacy. And it's much less complicated, so they can fantasize just hearing the girl's voice. And then you get to the end of the 30 seconds, click, and I guess you have to call up again. They've actually put in place barriers so they can't call them up on their personal phone. But it's a little bit sad to me that this is happening, and I'm sure it'll make a lot of money for the company. I think it's related, if I'm not mistaken, to Pokemon. So it's this telephone service. Now moving right along in terms of Cool Japan, we get to this phenomenon that's getting a lot of attention, and that is sort of robots and robot love. I don't know if anybody has come across. There was a story about almost like a documentary about a lot of these lifelike images. I mean, we had Pepper that got a lot of attention, and as part of the story, you see Pepper dressed up in a number of outfits, and in homes. Pepper is helping older people feel less isolated, giving them companionship. This, I don't know what his name is, but this is this robot image of this guy. And I think that many people around the world are looking at Japan's innovation in robotics and focus on artificial intelligence. If you look at the R&D numbers, a lot of money's going into that. So how is that going to play out? It's hard to say. Is it going to be kind of the extreme, or will it be a service and a product that people can enjoy? Many who live in isolation, many who live as singles may be able to be comforted by these robots. But there's a whole genre of literature now related to this, robot love and robotics. So the name of the game going forward now this is actually an image I took at, can anybody recognize it? Issei Jingu. So what happened 2 years ago? Maybe we've forgotten. It was the G7. It was the summit at Issei Shima. And I have to really tip my hat to Abe for choosing that prefecture, because of course he wanted to get away from the golden route. He wanted to showcase a different part of Japan. There's a real sense of urgency now that all these dying communities, they're not going to be able to attract enough tourists. So they're making efforts to put more emphasis on ecotourism, on getting people to go to local farms, to visit with the Ama divers, we actually had a lunch with the Ama when I was there, covering the G7. And it's a remarkable visit, and it's quite, it could be really attractive to the world. When you go there, though, not too many foreign visitors right now. Now, you may wonder what this image is, but during the G7, all of the media got our own swag, stuff we all get. So we got a big bag of things, and in the bag was this cup that got a lot of attention. The press started writing about it. It was made in Japan, but then it had this, let's drink, let's get drunk, and it was this genuine Japanese sake cup. And so it got people sort of laughing about why would you really tout this? It was like, did they really think this through? There were a number of Japanese products that were like natural wood and were traditional, and then you had this thrown in. I have the cup. I like the cup, and it's a great souvenir, but you have to think a little bit about the image that's being projected. I think a better image is here, and Miko will recognize this, I believe. We were out having sushi and sake. I ordered my sake with the sushi, and this bottle came out, and I turned it around, and I said, oh my gosh, Nation Brand Japan, this is how you do it. So you have this story within a story, talking about the history, going back to Miyazaki family in Suwa, Nagano Prefecture since 1662. The sake is made, was the birthplace of yeast number 7, in case anybody was wondering where yeast number 7 came. And then this blue bottle is part of the Swiss International Airline in-flight selection. So this is a company that is doing it right, inviting in somebody who may not know Japanese, but giving them a little bit of the history, the appreciation for history in Japan, the appreciation for craftsmanship and families that have been devoted to one product over centuries. And in the United States, whenever I would come across a product that I really liked over the years, I might write a letter. You know, back in the day, I'm that old, you would write a letter, you would print it out, you would put it in the mail. Do you remember this? Okay. And I remember writing a company, I tried their soup, and it was terrific, gluten-free. And about a week later, I got a big package from them with all their various products. So I told my students, I said, if you're smart, or maybe your parents, write them a letter and tell them this is a nice touch to give people kind of a sense of connection to a product. And who knows, they might send you a couple of bottles. But wait until you're 20, right? So this is an image. I think this was a home run, of course, for the nation brand image of Shinzo Abe before he started his bromance with Donald Trump. This is also May 2016 for the meeting with the Shinto priests at Ise Jingu. All of the G7 folks had come in, Merkel and Justin Trudeau, who kind of, he sidled in like a, celebrity, like a, everybody was sort of watching him, but then it was like a Hollywood premiere to the anticipation of Obama coming. And you could hear people cheering, Obama-san, outside. And when they crossed the bridge, he went to meet them, and that same day, where did he go but to give his speech in Hiroshima, which became a bestseller, right? So that was then, and this is now. So of course, as you all know, later that year we had an election, and Japan is such a close ally to the United States, had a new president, had a turn of the page with the election of Donald Trump. This is indeed also a video. Didn't see any of it. So they kept showing it. Actually, I thought he was quite graceful in that tumble. And so it might have been embarrassing for Abe, but they made up and they made hats together. Do you all recall this? And it says, Donald and Shinzo, what does that say? Make alliance even greater. You're shaking your head. These are likely collector items now. In the larger scheme of things, in terms of nation brand Japan, by 2020, ostensibly, Donald Trump will still be in office, right? He may take quite a hit this midterm election. But looking forward now to 2020 and beyond, where might we see Japan? I mean, we know Japan is very welcoming, famous for its cuisine, its hospitable service, and it's going to take in these growing throngs of foreigners. And will this alliance be also featured in 2020? Because I don't know if you all have thought about it, and this is my last comment. I have one more slide. The most altering to Japan's supernation brand, this is really my editorial comment here, is the likelihood of Japan moving away from its pacifist constitution. And Shinzo Abe has set 2020 as the deadline to amend Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution, which we know effectively outlaws all acts of wars. So is a more aggressive military posture for Japan a soft power advantage? Or is this proposed mix of soft power being culture, soft power being values? Again, Japan is not seen as a hard power or military power, but will this change to the Constitution alter Japan's cultural superpower status? And I think to maintain the peace constitution and to have Japan take on an even larger role in international development assistance, in providing technology and innovation for social issues like growing old, in serving as an example of sustainability of the economy, creating more of a green economy. I think that's to be celebrated more than altering the Constitution, but that's just me. So right now, the bottom line of Japan's nation brand is driven by safety, convenience, a respite from the world outside that often appears and in fact is less safe and secure. So my final comment before our opening it up to dialogue is sort of be careful what you wish for. If you do alter this peace constitution that dramatically, you may create a new normal. You may see Japan become more like the rest of the world. And I think Japan as a model to the world should be less like the rest of the world. So I'm going to stop there and open it up. And one more comment or one more slide. This is a fantastic exhibit of Japan's soft power and culture power. And when I was in Paris in December and March, they were really touting this. Abe would have been there for the kickoff if it weren't for the terrible tragedies from the heavy rains and the mudslides and all. He stayed in Japan as opposed to go to the opening. But this will run from this month through February. And it's a celebration of the ties between Japan and France. And it's such a wonderful, really airing of the music and the cinema design. They have it all here. Of course, France and Japan are world-renowned for cuisine. And they really see themselves on an equal plane with each other. So I wanted to end on a high note because this is an incredible journey that many of the ministries have put together, MEXT and METI and MOFA, of course, along with the Japan Culture Institute. If you haven't been to the Culture Institute in Paris, it's right next to the Eiffel Tower, and it gets a lot of tourists who come in and learn about Japan. They may never come to Japan, but they learn a lot about Japan in France. So I wanted to end on more of a high note, and now welcome your comments and discussion for the next half an hour. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Nancy. So we've heard that Japan can be a model for old age and even for death.
Yes.
I guess that's an imaginative form of soft power, but a rather logical one. So we have about half an hour for Q&A. So if you have a question, please come to the mic so we can record you. If for some reason you don't want your voice to be recorded for eternity, ask a question from your seat. But everybody hears better if you come up to the mic. And I'll let Nancy take the Q&A.
I mean, it's interesting that you say that about, maybe Japan shouldn't be talking about death and dying. But I mean, statistically speaking, this is a population where people are going to live to super ages, right? So if Japan is in kind of the driver's seat there, and along with low fertility, it's getting a lot of attention with this, probably as much as where it ranks in terms of gender equality. Why not turn a negative into a positive? I mean, we all are going to hopefully age, and we will have to think about quality of life. And when I think about how many wonderful gifts Japan has given to the world, not just in terms of cool Japan, you can see I really didn't focus on that. That gets a lot of attention now, but rather thinking about the sort of the shrinking parts of Japan that often the ministries want to avoid talking about because they seem kind of negative. So what I'm suggesting is turn it into a positive. And the way you do that is to take the generations or bring the generations together and to have dialogue. Some share houses now are cross-generation. And they're not just for young people, but it's young people living with older. When you go out into the countryside of Japan, it's very typical to find across generations living in one household. And of course, the rates of fertility are higher there because people have a greater sense of security. Japan has a legacy of putting a lot of emphasis on the family. That's why the Ozu Tokyo story was probably a bit shocking. It was showing, oh, look, what's happening in this post-war World War II era. With the rise of the young people moving to the city, they're getting disconnected from their parents and grandparents, and that is creating fissures in the social cohesion of the nation. So I I've been struck ever since we first met, Robert, and we were talking about the lack of globalization, but I've really been struck by the generational differences and the lack of really conversation happening across these generations, especially in the city. But perhaps more in the countryside is where we could hear some of these stories about how generations can work together to create a higher quality of life for all.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation this evening. So recently, a piece of legislation was passed to add like 6 more seats in the upper house of the Diet. And people are not so happy, saying that it's favoring the LDP and all that. And on top of that, there are some issues in Japan with freedom of media press, and there also seems to be disparity between the citizens and what's going on in the policy-making process. So my question for you is, do you think there are some immediate problems to the democratic institutions in Japan, and could this affect their global image or even soft power?
I write about this a lot, but I didn't get into it. You may be familiar with Jeff Kingston's book on contemporary press in Japan. I actually have a chapter in there about the media. And I do think if I were really to brief the government and those who were involved in the planning of 2020, I would say, I'm not sure you're quite ready for the heat from the press coming in here. Because the press clubs in Japan and a lot of self-censorship that takes place, which I think you're alluding to, it's a story that's not really known outside Japan, but this is, there's a lot of ritual in telling stories in the press here. There's not a whole lot of investigative journalism. You pay a price for that. Doesn't mean there aren't scandals. The tabloids tell about scandals, but they're here and gone, like gone with the wind. So what you're missing is the systemic understanding of what's happening. And all you have to do is look at the ranking of Japan in various indices having to do with the free press. And it's not getting better, it's getting worse as we go towards 2020. And why is that? Well, we have the state secrets law. We do have this LDP that stays in place. Many people don't get involved in politics. I was at an event recently where they were talking about women getting involved in politics in Japan, and I thought, well, how about people getting involved in politics? Because a lot of people here I meet don't really have a great interest. There's a lot of apathy, and I think that has grown over time with the dominance of one party. And I realize the LDP has differences of opinion within the LDP, but you don't have the real rigorous debate and discussion about politics and issues. At least I don't experience that. And without that, it's really hard if you're passionate. I don't know if you're passionate about politics, but if you are, where do you put that energy? Where do you go with that? Who do you turn to? Because politics, since it's associated with conflict, is often ignored, right? You don't want to really express an opinion that may be different from your friend you're going out and having a drink with, so then you don't talk about politics. But what I suggested at the very beginning is that Japan's real message to the world, there are a lot of things working so well here. And in terms of needs improvement, I would say to have more national dialogue on issues. And how do you do that? You start with the schools. Well, that's difficult because they're very centralized, the curriculum. That's another problem. So in the United States, it's very decentralized, and depending where you go to high school or junior high or even university, you're going to get exposed to very different issues. But here, everybody's studying the same curriculum. We see how that percolates then regionally, where you're getting a different version of history. And that's where we get contentious, not so much debates, but sometimes attitudes across the Northeast Asian region, is that people feel like, well, my history is different from yours. And you can't really even engage in that when you don't know the history. So we have to look at some fundamentals here. it's harder for me as a guest in this country. I'm a foreigner, right? I'm an academic, I'm a scholar, but a lot of my work is outside of Japan. I care a lot, though, about my host country. And I don't always know how far I can express my point of view because I'm a guest and I want to be appreciated here. So I often say it will require the Japanese to get more involved. But then you have to wonder, you know, why don't more people get involved? There is some training going on now. I met a couple of Japanese faculty the other day who are doing a gender parity academy, and they're working with young women who had never thought about running for office, but who are now thinking about it. And one of the good things about running for office here is you don't have the big leap in terms of raising all this money. In the United States, it's always, where are you going to get the money? It's not so much male or female, but it's like, how are you going to raise the money? But here, it's more open in terms of that. But for women, they don't often have the confidence to run politically for office. So I do think there is a lot related to Japan's narrative that has to do with some of the problems, the challenges with the media internally. There's no question about it, and that's what you're getting at. So thank you.
Okay. I am a long-term resident here in Japan. I've been here a little bit over 40 years. And when I first came here, I was not as well-to-do as I am now. So I had a little apartment, with no bath, no shower, so I went to the public bath every day. And over and above just getting clean, I started to learn and talk to the community. And after that, went to graduate school, started working, got my own apartment, married locally, produced a couple daughters, produced a granddaughter and such. And where I'm living now we have a hot springs. And I'm in the southern part of Tokyo. I'm in Otoku. I don't know if you know that. It's near the airport.
Yeah.
And we're promoting, I'm doing a lot of promoting in the area, particularly around the area of onsen, and there's a lot of fabricators, so business. And my real question is hot springs promotable globally? And part of you're talking about community, you're talking about villages, you're talking about, let's say, gender differences. They all meet in the public bath.
Right.
And we've made brochures, we've made videos and stuff, and we've got to explain you don't get in the bath with your bar of soap, and you have to take your shoes off. And this. Is this promotable to the point where it'd be interesting?
Yeah.
Not only getting clean, but also there's a community there, and you're meeting people there, and there's a long history to it.
Yes.
Of your meeting your village friends there, your work colleagues, and obviously grandma's in there with a granddaughter. So I want to get your feeling on branding in the area of particularly hot springs, onsen and sento.
Well,
Thank
let
you
me
very
take a survey here. I mean, do you all think that the onsen, there's a strong association there? When I was in the south and around Oita and Beppu, is it? Where they had all the onsen. They're certainly using that as part of tourism. My first time in Japan, we went to the onsen. I had a homestay with my Japanese host family, and this was outside Kyoto. And I certainly didn't know really how to act appropriately. I just followed what they were doing. But I agree with you that it could be very sort of marketable. I mean, if you relate it certainly to starting conversations and kind of letting your hair down. I mean, usually when there are visitors coming to Japan, there's kind of a little bit of, have you been to the onsen, you know, and are you comfortable with that? Because you know what happens, right? And so I saw it as a big part of Japan's history, and I eagerly participated. But it seems to be marketed quite well. I don't know exactly the overall number of them, but I think what you're doing, you're already serving as a cultural ambassador in your own right. And this is related to what I said earlier, that we need to collect these stories and to find out what people are doing. because they serve as inspiration for people. So you could meet someone who could say, I'm going to start the same thing in my community because my experience has been similar. I've really learned a lot about Japanese society this way. So I think what you're doing is already a way of branding. And it's just a matter, we use the term branding, we think of it as corporate and sort of big companies doing branding. But branding really just has to do with your good name and reputation. So whether it's at a national level or at a personal level, it's promoting the best that you are. And as I said earlier, there's so many good things about Japan. I mean, that's why I'm here. And it's even, there's so many good things about Japan that it's hard for me to tout study abroad with some of my students, because I talk a lot about international exchange in here. And they'll say, well, professor, you're here, so why are you telling us to leave Japan? And I'll say, oh, you got me, that's right. But I try to frame it in terms of not so much global competition, but just enhancing your life over a lifetime, that you'll be better off. You'll have friends in other countries. It will be enriching. It will make you more interesting and interested. And of course, when they go abroad and come back, I often hear from them and they said, oh my God, this was life-changing, but I just had to get out, you know, and it was difficult for them to make that leap initially. So I like what you're doing, and it is part of branding, definitely, so thank you. Question? Yes. You're a plant.
It's not going to be about smoking.
Okay.
Yeah, I was curious about, because I think we talked about this before, but with the sexlessness. I'm wondering if you could elaborate further as why that's such like a fascinating topic for the foreign media, because I did a podcast about Japanese sexuality, which is like a really huge topic, and there's not a lot of good, solid information on it. One of the sources I talked to is Dr. Kitamura, who is the head of the Japan Family Planning, and you know, it's what I would think would be really striking as compared to other countries is that there is such a few number of women using oral contraception. Which I guess doesn't fit in, because if you go, oh, sexlessness, oh, and they have low birth rate, oh, so it all fits together, you know. But if you say very low use of oral contraception and a low birth rate, then that's kind of like a head scratcher, I guess. So I'm just wondering if you have any more thoughts on that.
Well, the reason why I even brought this up again is because in 2013, when I first gave this talk at Temple, the BBC did a special called No Sex Please, We're Japanese. You can still see that, and it was very high production value, and it was remarkable because it was so heavily laden with that image of Japan as an outlier. And then as I began to learn more about Japan and the Japan studies, I realized that a lot of Japan studies gets into the exceptionalism of Japan. And when you walk that path, you open yourself up to the stereotyping. That if you really are like no other place, if you happen to watch the documentary, the moderator says she's in the middle of Shibuya Crossing. And she says, I'm standing here in Japan, which is like no other place on the planet, you know. And I thought, oh, okay. What does that mean? Does that draw you in? You're very curious, of course. But it's just reinforcing stereotypes, because it's making the Japanese so different from everybody else that they're not as relatable. I mean, that's very strange to me. So I can't quite figure out why that keeps happening. And there are a lot of stories, we've all read them and scratched our heads too, that focus on the robot restaurant and the Shibuya, as I mentioned, or the maid cafes, or the cuddle cafes, whatever it is, kind of the extreme. And they're not really talking to regular, everyday Japanese. Is that a language gap? Is it a matter of they can't find the sources? Is it a little bit of lazy editorializing in the newsroom where they say, oh, just go to Japan and write about the robot restaurant? But there's a sameness, there's a homogenizing effect there. And so it continues to paint this very broad picture that is virgins in Japan, sexless Japan. These are all headlines, but you don't really get to the crux of what's really happening here. And I think you won't unless you can get people to open up a little bit. So, I mean, I don't know if those nude sketch sessions have made a difference, but that was several years ago, so we could go back and find out what has happened to the dating life of those men. I mean, that's just one answer. I don't know if anybody has any thoughts on that, but it's intriguing to me because ultimately, when you're talking about the future of a country whose population may be 90 million, you know, not too many decades from now, that's going to have enormous pressure to take in foreign workers, there's a real seriousness to this that is about, you know, why aren't people deciding to marry and have children? And of course, it's happening in a lot of countries. But I think Japan will continue to be a focus in this area. So my answer would be deal with it very openly. Address it on your own terms. Don't let the outside media come in and paint with a broad brush, but show people in different scenarios, married couples, unmarried couples, and show the reality of how people are dealing with modern living. I mean, there could be a lot of factors. I thought that part of it was that men didn't have the same incomes that they used to have. So the whole dating ritual had changed. Japanese men, their income had dropped maybe a third to a half of what it had been. So you're going to lose confidence then in trying to approach a woman to date. You don't, these are not the kind of the magical, the so-called economic miracle days where you're the kingpin and you can show her the best. And so what do you do then? If you lose your confidence, you're going to continue to sort of back off, and then there may be this giving up. But as I said, this is happening in other places, so it might be worthwhile if you're in the academy to look at some of these patterns regionally or internationally. It's happening in China, it's happening in Korea, it's not just here. But really talk to people and find out and see if there can be a way to not exactly turn it around overnight. I always thought with womenomics, I'll be frank, I mean, Abenomics and then womenomics, what has the message been there but to return to the workplace right after you have children? So you're assuming that you get married, you have children, you go running back to the workplace. You want these super women. And it's the government putting enormous pressure on women and then the men that they'll date to go back in to do it all. And maybe they don't want to do it all. Maybe they don't want to have a long-term career. You've got to give people different paths, different career paths, different options instead of this one-size-fits-all. And what we're seeing internationally is that people are not finding the government narrative, the messages coming out of governments, as the most credible. So you've got to find other informers on this to get people to change their behavior.
One question, I wanted to, I think it might incorporate into the generation aspect you were talking about, but do you have any insight on the senpai-kohai aspect?
In what sense?
Just generally.
In terms of rank, or do I see value in that, or could you give me a little bit?
It's something I think has already been established, right? So how does Japan get from that to inclusiveness or whatnot? Yeah.
Right. Well, I don't necessarily see that as a bad thing. It really depends on the context, right? What's going on there. So you hear senpai used, I mean, somebody who's a senior or a role model Indeed, I mean, that can be very valuable in terms of leadership. But if you're suggesting potentially some abuse of power, I don't quite know if you mean that, then of course you would have to address that, not just in the workplace, but everywhere. And I think that's part of that national dialogue that we're not having. It seems to me that Japan is going through some growing pains related to globalization. It's going to have to figure out how global do we want to be, how much like the rest of the world. It doesn't seem to really want to be like the rest of the world, which I'm okay with, as I said. And as I said earlier, Japan should model to the world sustainability, international assistance. Japanese love the UN, they love UNESCO, they love these international organizations that do good. Many Japanese I've talked to, I've interviewed for my Abe research, they feel very proud of having an image of doing good in the world. So if that is involving the junior with the senior, and you're doing good, and there's kind of a benefit of goodwill, international goodwill, I see no problem with that. But what we have to do is look at the particular context of what's happening here. Increasingly, we're hearing that Me Too is not taking off in Japan. Why is that happening? Well, I think it's seen in many respects as a bit of an import. I mean, it is happening, the dialogue is happening internationally, but Japan will have to have a different conversation on its own terms. It's already been transposed into We Too, so that it's not so much about the individual, but rather we too, you know, as a society, what's happening in terms of diversity and inclusion. And I think that this whole D&I dialogue, or LGBT, that is taking place, but under a very, kind of in a very specific group and sectors, international companies. And so it seems to be something that is very familiar to everybody. But I think that a lot of Japan is really kind of cut off from a lot of these discussions. And you're undoubtedly going to find people who are going to be resisting to this type of globalization, this resisting to being like everywhere else. I could be wrong, but I do think there's kind of a precious quality to this culture, and I've often said that I have never felt safer anywhere else in the world. It doesn't mean it's completely blemish-free or without crime, or, but we've all experienced that, and we wonder, you know, we say, oh, well, that's Japan. And so I hope that we never take that for granted, that sense of social trust that we have here. And if you're a foreigner, you have to participate in that. So you come here and you act responsibly too, because that's such a high value. So without a lot more information, you know, that's kind of the best I can say, but I do hope that we continue these dialogues. And I have to credit, in fact, what they do here with ICAS, with helping to get these dialogues going.
My name is Kurt Sieber. I'm a resident in Japan for almost 60 years. And same as some other people already said, and as you say, I mean, I'm very happy in Japan. That's why I'm still here. However, I have a problem in creating a super brand for Japan as a dying country. And I'm fighting very hard in the other direction. Actually, I have 4 children and 8 grandchildren. Unfortunately, and again, almost aiming on what you just mentioned is, all my daughters have decided to go to the United States, and they will never be back. And so out of the 8 grandchildren, 6 of them are in the United States. So there is a real problem. And so if I want to go through all these things, we'll still be here by midnight. But so I concentrate just on the demography aspects. I mean, why are we facing this situation, particularly with the low fertility. I mean, Mr. Abe is a great salesman. He can sell almost anything to the Japanese population, but very few of the things which he promises are actually happening. And when...
We're running out of time.
Okay, so, so how can we improve the demographic situation? How can we encourage the younger people to take responsibility? Because having a family is not just entertainment and sex,
Yeah.
it is more than that. We have definitely a great financial problem in Japan at every level. I mean, many young people cannot afford to get married.
Let me try.
Okay.
Let me give this a shot, okay? I mean, you kind of put the nail on the head, didn't you? You said financially they can't afford to have children, and that's happening. That's part of the internal conversation that many are having. I think for many young people, they have enormous pressure on them here, because I deal with Japanese young people in my classes, and they may feel as if they are expected to do certain things. I mean, they come from parents and grandparents who had more of the cradle-to-grave reality of working for the company, and the company was like a family, like I was saying with Morita, and Sony would take care of you. Well, that's not the case now. So without a better balance that Koike has talked about, that a lot of the women in business conferences address, this balance of you spend an enormous amount of your life in the workplace. And I know traditionally that's where you would meet your partner. Even the boss would get involved in that. Well, that's not exactly the reality now. So people don't want to spend all their lives in the workplace. They want a certain quality of life. And they want to be able to either choose to marry or not. And you have to give options even related to not marrying and having children. I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be so traditional. So what has happened internationally is that you have different types of families emerging with same-sex couples having children. I mean, it's a different world now. So with Japan, it can't be one-stop shopping. And I share your concern about a decline in population, but the silver lining there could be coming up with technology. It's not likely this fertility rate's going to go up. If anything, it's going to go down. So you'd have to come up with technology to promote sustainable living that would free people up to have that quality of life, whether or not they have children. And I think just the image of the nuclear family is changing so much. Of course, if we had more time, I would want to know why all your daughters went to the United States. And I know you're not happy about that, but we do know, I can leave you all with this in terms of study abroad. What's happening in Japan, it's overwhelmingly women participating in it, 60 to 70%. And I've written a little about this, that they are becoming gender diplomats for Japan. What happens to them is they come back with a feeling of more liberation, they gain the language skills. They don't always identify with staying in Japan, or at least not forever, but they get globalized. Well, they should be welcomed back in and integrated into the culture, but I think many of them feel a little bit singled out, that they've become too global. It wasn't too many years ago, the New York Times had a front page story about this, the job hunt that goes on in the spring, and how many people who go abroad to get extra training, and they were coming back and the Japanese companies didn't want to hire them because they had gone global and they wouldn't fit with the Japanese model, which we know you get most of your education on the job and not as much at the university. So you kind of have a little bit of a holding pattern in many universities, and then you go on and you learn about the Japanese values on the job. So we've got to come up with a variety of models, because we're living in an era now where it's increasingly sort of figuring out identity. Who am I? And it's much more fluid than it used to be. And Japan is part of that. So I know that's threatening to some people, but we have to allow for that continuum. And I think allowing for that and giving people a sense of believing in themselves might help them to feel comfortable to want to go out and find a partner and have children. Did you turn these people away who had questions?
Fortunately, the logistics so that we have to vacate the room and
I see. Okay.
make it usable for tomorrow. So thank you so much. It's a wonderful way to end the season.
Thank you.
And
I was just getting started, but
we very much hope to have you again next academic year. And
All
as you know,
right.
in 1 year we're moving to Showa Women's University.
That's
We'll
right.
be in Sangenjaya, a very nice neighborhood.
Yes.
So thanks again.
All right.
Wonderful way to end the season.
Well,
So
thank you all
again.
for coming. I appreciate it so much. All right.